To understand this movie, we must go back, gentlemen. We must go back. To understand
Are we going
the
back to the books? Just like they do every other movie?
So to understand the beginning, of course, we have to go to the first book, which is Ian Fleming's first novel. So this book was released in 1953. And then a year later, in 54, he sold the rights for only $1,000 to CBS to do the teleplay for Climax, was the name of the television show.
Climax presents Casino Royale from the bestseller by Ian Fleming.
Aren't you the fellow who was shot?
No, I'm the fellow who was missed.
But that is the first appearance of James Bond on screen, which we covered that in our pilot episode, our very, very, very first episode. So you can check that out. A year after that, Fleming would sell the film rights. So that was the TV rights. He would sell the film rights to Casino in 1955 to somebody else. And that's partly why, Broccoli and Salzman, they didn't have the rights when they started Eon Productions for Casino Royale. So the first Casino Royale film that came out was a spoof film.
Casino Royale is too much for one James Bond.
And it starred actors such as Orson Welles played Le Chiffre or Le Chiffre.
Orson Welles is the heaviest heavy of Smirch.
David Niven.
David Niven is James Bond.
Woody Allen.
Woody Allen is James Bond.
And even Ursula Andress from Dr. No.
Ursula Andress is James Bond.
Ursula Andress.
I knew I was going to mess that
out
one
of
up.
respect for her, I'm going to correct you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Because I respect women.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, the important part was that film was under Columbia Pictures. So they couldn't use that first book. Another Eon nemesis was even planning on creating his competing Bond franchise. Our good old boy, Kevin McClory.
The real-life Blofeld.
The real-life Blofeld. Remember, he had the rights to Thunderball, which also included Spectre, was in that as well. So he had the rights to that tied up with Columbia Pictures. And of course, they made Never Say Never Again.
Sean Connery is Ian Fleming's James Bond in Never Say Never Again.
Basically, which is Thunderball remake. So his idea was like, oh, I'm going to keep doing these Bond films because I have Casino Royale and I have Thunderball. I could make more movies with this. And of course, Eon Productions is like, hold on, buddy. Like, you don't own James Bond, okay? Like, we have all the rights from Fleming himself.
He's such a bastard.
Yeah.
I want everything.
So how did Eon Productions get the rights back for Casino Royale? Well, it turns out that Columbia Pictures, aka Sony Pictures at this point, because Sony had acquired Columbia Pictures in the late 80s, they made a trade with MGM in 1999 for, guess what movie? You wouldn't guess.
Wait, give me a hint. Give me a hint.
It's a superhero movie with spiders.
Oh, I was going to say Spider-Man. Oh,
yeah,
man.
So Spider-Man, MGM had the film rights to Spider-Man. And so they swapped the rights. They were like, we'll take the rights to Casino Royale if you give us Spider-Man. And that was also partly in due with a lawsuit that also included Kevin McClory. I don't know the logistics of it.
What a mess.
That's kind of what happened. It was a whole mess. This happened in 1999.
It was also Ian Fleming could make, what, like $1,000? All this mess over $1,000.
Well, the CBS rights for the TV were $1,000, but when he sold it for the film rights, it was for like $6,000. And again, that's in 1955. So I don't know how much that equates till today. But
and then he died less than 10 years later. It's just sad. The whole thing is just sad. The whole franchise is a mess. And even after they reboot it with this movie, it's still a mess. Everything's a mess. It's just awful.
We'll get to that. Let's get to that.
Still great.
So then they got the rights to Casino. They didn't get the rights to Thunderball. And we had talked about before when we got to which one was it, For Your Eyes Only, they were just like, you know what, F you, Kevin. We don't need Blofeld to make these Bond films. We can do it without Blofeld. And that was that whole point of, throwing Blofeld down the chute, essentially.
And they should have stuck to that.
So because of that, because Kevin's like, well, I have Thunderball introduced Spectre, therefore I own Spectre. It just turns out that when 2006 rolls around, when this movie comes out, not that long after, Kevin McClory passes away. His wife, in turn, is like, here's Thunderball. You can buy the rights back to Thunderball. So Eon Productions got Thunderball back. So therefore, that's when they started doing Spectre. It's just weird how the timing of all that happened because you can see how the writers of this movie really, really wanted it to be Spectre.
Money isn't as valuable to our organization as knowing who to trust.
They couldn't say the name of the organization.
Which works.
It does work. Like, I don't think we needed to say it. If you're a fan, you'd be like, oh, I know who this is.
Yeah.
But then when you know where the films go after this, you're like, this is a mess.
Yeah, but talk about that later.
So they swapped the rights for this film. That was in 1999, which is right when they were doing World Is Not Enough. And then in 2002, we did Die Another Day, which is a weird turn of events like right before this movie comes out in 2005, Sony acquires MGM, thereby making this movie a Sony picture, which means every device that Bond owns is a Sony product.
Or interacts with.
Yeah, that Vio.
Sony Ericsson phones.
No one has ever used those phones.
And Sony is just so product placement heavy with everything they make. So it's just no surprise at all.
It's kind of a joke.
But it's, you know, product placement makes the movie world go round these days, whatever.
Sure.
Like we would say, Bond has never been above product placement. It's just always been products that we can't afford.
Rolex.
Omega watches and Aston Martin DB5s and all that stuff, or the DBS, I guess.
But to be fair, this movie, when it comes to the product placement, because they knew they went too heavy in the last film, they toned it down, especially in their marketing, as how much product placement they were doing, because they realized that left a sore taste in people's mouths on how much there was.
Hello, it's Q. Hello, Q speaking. Hello, it's Q. Oh, what do you want, 007? Hold on. Good evening, Em.
See the latest Bond film, Die Another Day, at a theater near you.
So the question remains, so why didn't Brosnan return? Because obviously he was a great Bond. Like I think we all would say that he was a good James Bond. Brosnan said in 2004, 2 years after Die Another Day, that he was retiring from the role. But when it comes down to it, based off the poor reception of Die Another Day, how the world had changed due to 9/11, Eon Productions was looking for a different route to take the franchise. Fortunately, with recently acquiring the rights to the first Bond novel, this gave them an in for what they would do next. Brosnan, being too old to pass as a new Bond, was out, and they began looking for the next James Bond, which is kind of makes sense. He was looking rough in the last movie, so there's no way they were going to bring him back for Casino, which brings me to the next thing, is also in 2005, which I'm still baffled because I don't understand when they bring this up a lot. And I'm like, this is more coincidence than it is like they saw this movie and were like, oh, we're going to do the same thing. So in 2005, we had Batman Begins rebooting its respective franchise.
Chris Nolan, shout out for the millionth time.
With the millionth time, right? Which after this film would forever weirdly intertwine the Craig films and the Nolan Batman films in my own head canon, which again, we'll get to that as the next couple movies come along.
A guy with an unlimited amount of money who goes and beats up baddies with a bunch of gadgets provided by a gadget man. Yeah. One guy wears a suit, the other guy wears a suit. It's almost like we should do the Batman movies next.
I feel compelled. So, okay, anyway, rebooting is simply stating that you are starting a given franchise anew.
Like the phoenix from the ashes, life begins anew.
God. So you're saying the next entry's canon does not continue the previous entry's canon, and that it's a fresh start. I only make that distinction because some people get confused on what's a remake, what's a reboot. So like a remake would be like what Never Say Never Again was, which was we're taking the same script, the same story, and redoing it.
Yeah. And it just so happened to have Sean Connery, but that's beside the point. It is a straight up remake.
Much like this movie still has Judi Dench.
And then other people try to headcanon their way through the timeline where it's like, okay, Casino Royale, and then the events of this with Connery, and then more. They try to jump around, and it's like, no. It's very simple. And we don't need to talk about the movies after Casino, but it's very simple. They had 20 films.
Yeah.
And then they started fresh.
Yeah.
And this new series is going to be self-contained. This movie takes place in the year 2006. It doesn't take place in the 50s or the 60s. No. It is starting new. It's hitting reset. There's and then it turns into Sean Connery for 2 movies, and then Roger Moore for a couple. No. 20 movies are behind us. This is all new.
I think when people refer to that, they're saying the events of those movies are taking place at a further point in time.
I say no.
But then again, that's how
the weird thing
hold
is,
on,
I've never thought of any of that.
Okay, so let me finish though. At times though,
I just live my life.
As we all know, they ended up picking Daniel Craig as James Bond. And a lot of people hated this because Craig is blonde and not brunette, like every other incarnation of the character.
James Blonde.
James Blonde.
James Blonde.
Classic.
Or is it Bond? I'm confused.
I'm a little confused.
It's the perfect internet thing. The internet is always just nitpicking stupidity, you know? Heath Ledger, the guy from 10 Things I Hate About You, is going to be a bad guy?
Yeah.
No. And then it ends up being the best thing ever, and everybody shuts the hell up after that.
And now you're just like,
at first, everybody's
whatever.
it's got to be like 10 alarm fire, you know.
Yeah.
Oh my God, James Bond, his hair is, you know, they should dye it, you know, which would be.
Yeah. And of course, I've got to mention, you know, other people that were up for the role was Henry Cavill was a contender. But at the time,
at
the time he was 22, so they were like, "You're a little too young." Like they wanted, because remember, like Dalton was young when he originally auditioned, and he was too young at the time.
They still should have given it to him, but yeah, he was.
Yeah,
too
but
young.
he's a little too young, so they're like, "We need someone just like hitting that 30s mark." But like, if you're too young in your 20s, but you're about right in some time in their early 30s, mid 30s,
like
so basically
Sean
our
said,
age right
it should
now.
be 35.
Yeah, Carl Urban. I don't know how to say his name.
Dude.
He was up for the role.
Oh, somebody from Lord of the Rings would have been in this?
So you had him and Ewan McGregor were also up for the role. They didn't get
Ewan
it, of course.
McGregor.
At the time, Craig was known for such films as Road to Perdition and Tomb Raider. But my personal favorite was always the 1995 Disney classic, A Kid in King Arthur's Court.
You're a knight in training. Good fit. Can you see?
Perfectly.
A Kid in King Arthur's Court.
How embarrassing.
For Daniel Craig or Ryan McCurdy?
just in general.
It's just fun to see Daniel Craig in that era because you're like, oh yeah, this guy goes on to play James Bond, and then he's in this silly Disney movie where he plays a knight.
You really gotta give it to him for Layer Cake. I mean, Layer Cake was like right before this. Kind of a funny note is that the end of Layer Cake is the...
My name? If you knew that, you'd be as clever as me.
Nobody knows my name, and I'll never tell you my name, blah, blah, blah. And then the end of this movie is him giving his character name.
The name's Bond.
You know my name.
It's just kind of like a weird parallel between those two crime movies that he made back to back, basically.
Quentin Tarantino was up to direct or write some version of this movie prior to this movie coming out. He wanted to make this movie with Brosnan and set it at a different time period. But of course, they're never going to do that. So
the reason they wouldn't do that, they hire, quote, nobody directors, and they do it because James Bond is the star, not the director. And Quentin Tarantino, who makes great movies, but Tarantino's personality is tied up in his movies. You can't separate him from his movies. It's like he's always there waving in the background. So he would have made this about him, and that's why they're like, nah, dude, we need somebody who's going to, you know, it's almost like the Marvel thing. We need somebody who's going to play by our rules.
With like Martin Scorsese or whoever it was. I think it was Spielberg or Scorsese recently had said something about how all of the Marvel films are really, it's work for hire, really. Like, I think I'm misquoting who it was who said it, but basically they were saying like Marvel films are work for hire. They don't really hire filmmakers. They hire in much the same way television is done, where you hire a TV director, but they don't really have as much control. They really work with the actors, but that's, as far as their vision goes, it's not that far. That's not necessarily to say that they don't have anything.
It's not a bad thing. They
but
still
it's more to
bring
keep
a
things
lot.
a little more consistent. But I mean, to be fair, when we were talking about that, and you know, we were mentioning, you know, your Lord and Savior Martin Campbell coming back.
Do you feel the spirit?
Movie.
Do you feel the spirit, brother?
But the thing about Martin Campbell...
Do you feel the spirit, my brother?
Oh, my Lord. So Martin Campbell, though, like, I think it's interesting you point that out, because he's not an auteur director. He doesn't have a style that's specific to Martin Campbell. Like, you're not going to put in a Martin Campbell movie and then still be like, yeah, Martin Campbell directed this. Much like if you were to put in like a Spielberg or a Scorsese or like a Tarantino, as what we were talking about. Like you know instantly those are his movies. But that's part of the point.
It is arguable that makes him a better director.
Because his style is not seen.
The reason you don't go with Tarantino, who again makes great movies. Once again, maybe we should do those someday.
Yeah,
you don't go with that because it's like somebody I can't remember who it was, but some filmmaker at one point said something along the lines of, the moment that an editor wins an Oscar, which are meaningless these days, but whatever. The moment that an editor wins an Oscar or any kind of like major award, I don't work with them anymore. Why? Because that's the editor stepping out from behind the shadows, and it's like they edit in a way where it's noticeable. As opposed to a good editor, the editing becomes invisible. You don't even notice it. If you're noticing the editing, the editor is not doing their job correctly. So it is debatable that when a movie is so stylish that all you can see is the thumbprints of the filmmaker all over it, it breaks the immersion. And you don't want that. And so you could argue that Martin Campbell, let him be praised, is a better filmmaker than Tarantino.
But I mean, you can also, we were making the parallel with this and Marvel, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Like most of the directors in the Marvel canon, with the exception of a handful, that being maybe James Gunn and Taika Waititi, most of them don't really have distinct voices, because most of them, even the Russo brothers, are kind of
look at Taika.
They're very TV style.
His movie stands out. It sticks out like a sore thumb. It's very fun, but it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's like, hey, look, I made this movie. It's like chiseling your name into the statue of Marvel, like vandalizing the statue of Marvel. So like Scorsese, of course, is going to say that's a negative thing. And that he can say that because he's like the king. But when you have a franchise, everybody has to bow before the characters. And you mentioned TV. It's no different from TV. If you're going to come into this TV show, you have to bow down to the characters, because the characters are the things that are going to live on. And if you're just here to stick your thumbprint on this get out. Get out, because you're being selfish. You're not catering to, as M would put it, the big picture, which kind of transitions into one of the themes of this movie is about Bond learning to abide by the big picture, and not necessarily just his ego, but cater to the big picture versus yourself.
We're trying to find out how an entire network of terrorist groups is financed, and you give us one bomb maker. Hardly the big picture, wouldn't you say?
Your people would still welcome me with open arms, because they need what I know.
Do you have anything more, McCurdy?
I got two more things.
You got two more things?
I got two more things.
Well, off and do it.
Off. Just off. Actually, I think it's three. It's three cameos. So one of them, you're watching the movie, you're sitting there, and all of a sudden this guy turns around and you're like, wait, why do I know that face? And it's for like 2 seconds in the movie, and sure enough, it's Richard Branson.
No, it's Hugo Drax. I mean, Gustav Graves.
Graves.
Richard Branson.
Richard Branson of Virgin Mobile, because the airline that they were using for this film or whatever, he had a part in.
Yeah, you see Virgin planes here and there.
He probably put in his contract, was like, I need to be in the movie or put me in a cameo or something. They're like, sure, why not? We don't give a shit. You're giving us money, why not? I've heard stories where sometimes they'll do those kinds of things, but they just give them the footage. They don't actually put it in the final cut. But in this case, it was like, it doesn't matter. It's like for 2 seconds.
It's like a long shot of him. So he's kind of far enough away that you're not paying attention to the person. You're looking at the bad guy at the moment. Like Nance just said, he didn't even catch it. That's the perfect cameo when nobody catches it. That is the perfect cameo.
This one's not so much a cameo. It is just an actor who has been in other stuff later on, but then you see him in an earlier work. So we got Tobias Menzies. I can butchered his name, but I don't really care. He's from Game of Thrones. He was in Game of Thrones. You remember him?
He's the weak Tully. He was like the embarrassing Tully.
Anyway, he plays Villers, which when you watch the movie and you're a Bond fan, Villiers, but you think it's Bill Tanner. It's not.
Yeah.
And apparently they based the character to be Bill Tanner, but he's based off the guy who played Bill Tanner in For Your Eyes Only, whose name was James Villiers.
Because I was trying to figure out whether or not he was Bill Tanner, I looked into it myself, because I was like, they never say the name Tanner. So is this guy Tanner or not? And only one time does M say the name Villiers.
According to Villiers, you're the best player in the service.
And I guess she just took his word for it? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a reference to James Villiers, who played Bill Tanner in For Your Eyes Only, but also a reference to Amherst Villiers, an automotive expert name dropped in the original Casino Royale novel. So they're 2 instances of Villiers. So it's like 2 references at once. And it comes from the Casino Royale novel. So it's kind of
supposed to be a reference of a character. It's a weird thing to put in a movie.
Why not just do Tanner?
Just put Bill Tanner? Yeah.
Yeah, why not do Tanner? Yeah, I don't know why.
It's a weird thing. Then our boy Mikey G. Whiz plays the chief.
I never said G. Whiz once in this whole movie. G. Whiz, this movie's great.
Mikey G. Whiz sitting back with the Montergo. He's just sitting back with his
with
babes.
2 chicks. I want to know, was his character bribed with more than money?
Just sitting there with 2 chicks.
You know, yeah.
Consider him slimed.
That's a good bribe.
Consider him slimed, guys.
Consider him slimed.